Here's what just happened. The federal government briefly ran out of money for part of its operations over the weekend, and then came back online Tuesday morning after President Donald Trump signed a $1.2 trillion spending bill on February 3, 2026. The lapse lasted 4 days. It wasn't a full shutdown of the entire government. It was a partial funding break that mainly hit administrative functions, paperwork, and pay timing. But it was serious enough to rattle Washington and to set up another deadline just days away. The reason this matters now is simple. Most of the government is funded for the rest of the fiscal year, but the Department of Homeland Security, the agency that handles border security, airports, disaster response, and immigration enforcement, is only funded for about 2 more weeks. So while one crisis just ended, another negotiation is already ticking toward a mid-February deadline. Here's how we got here. Late on January 30 into February 1, the Senate approved a massive multi-agency funding package. Lawmakers separated out Homeland Security on purpose. That allowed them to keep the rest of government running while they argued over immigration enforcement. But the House of Representatives was out of session when the previous funding expired. At 12:01 a.m. Saturday, money legally stopped flowing to several agencies. That triggered a partial shutdown. During those 4 days, essential services kept running. Air traffic controllers stayed on the job. Military operations continued. Social safety net payments like Social Security and Medicare were not halted. Border officers and airport security worked as usual. What slowed or stopped were non-emergency administrative tasks. Some grant processing paused. Certain permits and internal agency work were delayed. Federal workers in affected offices were either furloughed, meaning temporarily told not to work, or labeled essential and required to keep working with delayed pay. Exact furlough numbers often take time to finalize, and early shutdowns rarely produce clean counts. What is confirmed is that agencies activated contingency plans, and thousands of workers experienced at least short-term pay uncertainty. Historically, Congress provides back pay after a lapse, and reporting indicates lawmakers are expected to act again to ensure affected workers are paid retroactively. But that still requires formal legislative language. It is expected, not automatic, until passed. On February 2, the House returned to Washington under intense pressure. The White House pushed lawmakers to accept the Senate deal unchanged. After hours of negotiations, the House approved the package 217 to 214, a razor-thin margin. That vote is a confirmed record vote. President Trump signed the bill at 8:15 a.m. Eastern on February 3rd. That signature formally restored funding and ended the shutdown clock. The 4-day shutdown refers to calendar time from the weekend lapse to the signing. Because it fell across non-work days, the visible disruption felt shorter to many Americans than longer shutdowns in the past. By comparison, last year's 43-day shutdown caused measurable economic damage and widespread service disruption. This episode was brief, but it still exposed how fragile deadline politics can be. The central reason for the standoff was immigration policy. Democrats pushed for tighter oversight and operational limits on immigration and customs enforcement. Proposals discussed in coverage include body cameras, warrant standards, and use of force rules. Republicans argued that tying enforcement agencies to new restrictions inside a funding bill could weaken border security. Supporters of the separation say it prevented a total shutdown. Critics say it postponed the real fight instead of solving it. Homeland Security was carved out because it is the pressure point where immigration enforcement, border politics, and public safety intersect. That agency funds TSA airport screening, FEMA disaster response, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE. Lawmakers chose to isolate the disagreement rather than risk shutting down the entire government. The trade-off is that DHS now carries its own ticking deadline. Coverage cites February 13th or February 14th as the next cutoff, depending on how the continuing resolution is counted. The 1-day difference reflects technical timing language in the bill, not a dispute over whether a deadline exists. Reports frequently reference two fatal incidents involving federal immigration agents in Minneapolis as political context driving Democratic demands. Those incidents are cited in coverage as part of the debate atmosphere. They are not formally written into the legislation. They function as political pressure, not statutory triggers. Was the shutdown avoidable? In theory, yes, Congress could have passed a short extension before the deadline, but negotiations over immigration hardened right as the clock expired. Weekend pressure tends to amplify brinkmanship. Leaders calculated that forcing a vote under shutdown conditions would move holdouts. That gamble worked, but only narrowly. What this means is mixed. Most of government is now funded through September 30th. That brings stability to defense, health agencies, education, labor, treasury operations, and diplomatic functions. The immediate economic shock risk is low. Analysts describe the macro impact as limited because the lapse was short, but DHS remains exposed. That agency could face another disruption in mid-February if talks collapse. For Americans, the practical effects are subtle but real. Federal workers may experience short cash flow bumps depending on payroll timing. Travelers likely won't notice changes at airports unless DHS funding falters again. Businesses that rely on permits or grant approvals saw brief slowdowns and could see them again if another lapse occurs. Investors are watching whether this becomes a pattern. So far, markets treat short shutdowns as noise, but repeated uncertainty can change that calculation. This does not settle the entire budget fight for the year. It settles most of it. It does not immediately change immigration law. It signals that immigration remains the hardest unresolved piece. It does not mean another long shutdown is inevitable. It does mean the next 2 weeks are a focused negotiation window. What happens next depends on whether lawmakers convert the short DHS extension into a longer agreement. They could pass another temporary patch, they could strike a compromise that adds oversight rules, or talks could stall, risking another lapse limited to Homeland Security. Signs of escalation would include failed procedural votes, public walkouts, or agencies issuing fresh contingency notices. For now, government operations are largely restored, but not fully stable. The immediate crisis ended with a signature. The underlying dispute moved to a smaller stage with a shorter clock. That is where the situation stands. A shutdown ended, most funding secured, one agency still on a deadline, and Washington heading into another round of high-stakes negotiations that will determine whether this was a brief scare or the opening chapter of a longer fight.